Hi, welcome to the Mistwood Publishing Book Club. I am your host, S.R. Mowry, and today we'll be looking at The Veil of Stars, Chapter 13, The Dwarf King. This chapter is pretty straightforward in that it is pretty much the companions. The first part, they're stuck in this Dwarven Kingdom, and they've been stuck. And part of why I did that was I didn't want to overload the reader with a bunch of details about the place right away. I kind of wanted to slowly introduce the reader to it, and if you read the chapter, I think you'll agree that that's what I do, and that the first chunk of the chapter we find that our companions have been kind of locked away for a little while, and their dwarf companions are nowhere to be seen, and so some of them, mainly Ruth, are panicking, kind of assuming the worst in their dwarven hosts, and it ends up being, that the dwarves come back and they thought they were being polite, because that's what, when dwarves, dwarvish custom, that would be what would be appropriate and polite, is to give your guests space. But clearly the elves in the companionship, that's not the way elves do it, so they kind of thought that they were prisoners. And to a small degree, they kind of are, because dwarves are they're not very open. They're very isolationistic, and we kind of get, before the dwarf show, we kind of get a little bit of a backstory on maybe why the dwarves and the elves don't get along in this world. We know that they typically don't, but beyond the differences just in personality and worldview, maybe what historical past is there between the two races, and this chapter kind of sheds some light on that. And we can see that even amongst the elven companions and Narbad, there is disagreement on the actual telling of the history of those events. And anyway, then Bothlin shows up, and Narbad and Linod end up going and seeing the Dwarf King. It is on their route to seeing the Dwarf King that we get to finally get a little bit of a visual of what this Dwarven Kingdom looks like, albeit for the most part pretty empty. And I really wanted to kind of set the stage for what the throne room looked like, and what the what the rooms and the chambers and the hallways looked like, because again, we've never really seen a Dwarven Kingdom in its prime depicted in a fantasy, well, at least Lord of the Rings, and R.A. Salvatore typically avoids it as well. So it is very important to me to do that, as well as there's a part where Narbad passes, right before he goes into the throne room, there is this area that's dedicated to the weapons of judgment, or the Forlos, and that's kind of a neat little plug into, well, it's kind of setting the stage and giving you some base information for actually the next book. Saga 2 does kind of have to deal with those weapons in large part, so it is kind of setting the stage for things to come, kind of without you realizing it's giving you some information about what is coming. And so yeah, lots of good information coming in, learning a bit more of the history of the dwarves, and by waiting to show you this until after the conversation with Ruth and the other elves, you already have a basic understanding of who Naren Stonearm is. And so when Narbad is talking about these pedestals where these weapons were, and he was the one that made them, you already have a pretty fresh and clear understanding of who that was, instead of putting all that information right here. Putting all that information all in one spot, it's spread out, and you can actually get to see it a little bit, instead of it just coming through dialogue. The description of the throne room, it's one of my favorite descriptions. I just really wanted to look at, well, what would a Dwarven Kingdom in its coolest form be with the color scheme that the dwarves of the Twin Mountains tend to prefer, which is really navy blue and like bright silver. I do have other dwarven kingdoms, obviously. If you look on the map there at the front of the book, you'll see that there's the Twin Mountains, but there's a dwarf kingdom over here, and then one right there too. They're all three very unique. They are the three biggest dwarven kingdoms on the whole globe that we know of, and I do have pretty unique settings for each of them, although this is the only one we get to see in this book. Yeah, they're all very unique, and so far it's just in my head, and that's not to say there aren't plenty of other dwarven kings around. Those are just the three big ones. So anyway, the king speaks to them, and it's a bit of a rough greeting, but that's because, dwarves and elves have a pretty tense relationship, and Narbad's kind of like sitting, he doesn't really, he probably, he favors the dwarves more than the elves, but, he's kind of on the fence and skeptical about the whole situation as well. And so King Rain we find out he wants Narbad to rescue his son, who is lost out in the wilderness to the north of the civilization, the Twin Mountains, in the land of mystery. And, after some consideration, it is decided that Bothlin, Linod, and Narbad will go out into the north and seek to find the Dwarf King's son. And that's kind of where it is set, where it finishes. This chapter is really meant to kind of set up the remainder of Part 2. Really the rest of Part 2 is going to be revolving around these events. Now specifically, the next chapter, The Glimmering Pool, I'll just put it this way, the book was almost called Saga 1, The Glimmering Pool. But it ended up being that I went with that just being a chapter name, but that to say that this is one of the more important chapters. Like, it's a big moment. I would say that chapter 14 is really the turning point for Narbad as a character. So the first chunk we had Narbad as this young, idealistic orc. Part 2, at least up until this point, he's been broken and bitter, and for good reason. And at this point we see another huge shift in his character, which will really define him for the rest of the series. This is kind of his a really big character moment for him. So definitely don't skip the next chapter. Definitely tune in. Not next week because it's Christmas season, but at the start of the new year, the first weekend I get back from the holidays, we will go over chapter 14, and we will go through Narbad's big moment together. Before that, though, the chapter does end with a little section, kind of update with Zach and kind of their plan for escape kind of being initiated. So next time we see them, a lot more will be going on, and we'll be with them a little bit longer. And so that will be really nice. I do believe that the next chapter is completely Narbad, Bothlin, and Linod. The whole chapter is just them. Oh wait, no, actually the last section of that chapter also has some Hale and Zach stuff as well. And chapter 15 is one of my favorites. Obviously I'm not going to say what it is because it would be a spoiler. And yeah, chapter 16 is when we have like the big moment with Zach and Hale. But that is what is going on. Getting pretty close to being done with part 2. I mean, really, like I said, this chapter is really kind of setting up the rest of part 2, and then we'll be in part 3. So that's all for this week. Have a wonderful, blessed week, and have a very Merry Christmas. Again, the next video will not drop until after the holidays, so after New Year's. I hope you have a wonderful time, drive safely, and peace out.